Story 1. It was a cold evening in late autumn, the kind where the wind seemed to curl around you like icy fingers. I was 10 years old, and I still remember the glow of the street lamps reflecting on the wet cobblestones as my friend Jamie and I wandered through the village. The year was 1999, and the air smelled of damp leaves and wood smoke. We weren't up to anything in particular, just killing time before we had to head home for tea. Jamie's mom worked as a barmaid at the Black Stag, one of the oldest pubs in our village. It had been standing since 1461, a fact the locals took great pride in. Its warped beams, low ceilings, and dimly lit corners gave it a character both inviting and a little eerie. I remember the way the sign outside creaked in the wind, like a warning we didn't understand. "We should stop in and say hi to my mom," Jamie suggested as we walked past. The door was ajar, warm light spilling out into the gloom. Inside, the place was quiet, the hum of a distant radio mingling with the faint clink of glasses. Jamie's mom was at the bar chatting with the landlord. We waved and exchanged a few words before deciding to leave. But as we turned to go, something caught our attention. The cellar door was open. Now, if you've ever been a curious 10-year-old, you'll understand. There was no hesitation, no thought of consequences, just an unspoken agreement as we exchanged a glance and crept toward the dark stairs. The air changed as we descended. It grew colder, heavier, and smelled faintly of damp stone and something sweet, like rotting fruit. The steps creaked beneath our feet, and our whispers echoed as if the space itself was listening. The cellar wasn't much to look at. Rows of barrels, crates of empty bottles, and stacks of dusty boxes lined the walls. It should have been boring, but there was something about the silence that felt wrong. We were about to head back up when it happened. "Excuse me," a voice said softly. We spun around so fast I nearly lost my footing. There, standing just a few feet away, was a woman. She was pale with a calm expression that didn't quite match the sharpness in her eyes. Her hair was pinned back, and she wore what I can only describe as a maid's uniform: long black dress, white apron, and a cap. The kind you'd see in an old film or a period drama. "You shouldn't be down here," she said, her voice low and steady. "It's not safe. You should go back upstairs, quickly." We didn't argue. Her words weren't harsh, but there was an urgency in them that made my stomach knot. Jamie grabbed my arm, and we bolted for the stairs without looking back. As we reached the top, the landlord was there, his large frame blocking the exit. "What the bloody hell are you two doing down there?" he barked, his eyes narrowing. "Sorry," Jamie stammered. "We were just looking around, but the lady told us to come back up." The landlord's expression shifted from anger to confusion. "What lady?" "The lady in the cellar," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He stared at us for a moment before muttering, "Stay here." Then he descended the stairs, his heavy boots thudding against the wood. Jamie and I stood frozen at the top, the open door yawning like a black mouth behind us. The air seemed colder now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching. Minutes ticked by, each one dragging longer than the last. When the landlord finally emerged, his face was pale. He didn't say anything at first, just glared at us. "There's nobody down there," he said finally, his voice low and strained. "Stop messing about, or I'll tell your parents." Jamie tried to protest, but the landlord cut him off. "Out! Now!" We didn't need to be told twice. As soon as we were outside, we ran, our breaths fogging in the cold air. We didn't stop until we were halfway to Jamie's house, our legs burning and our hearts pounding. "You saw her, right?" Jamie asked when we finally slowed down. I nodded. "She spoke to us. She told us to leave." For days, I couldn't get her out of my head. The way she'd appeared so suddenly, her calm demeanor, her strange, old-fashioned clothes. It didn't make sense. But what really stuck with me was the landlord's reaction. He wasn't just annoyed, he was scared. Few days later, I heard the stories. Rumors about a maid who had worked at the Black Stag centuries ago. They said she'd fallen, or been pushed, down the cellar stairs and broken her neck. Some people claimed she was still there, trapped, her spirit unable to move on. Story 2. I've always lived in quiet, unassuming places, Small towns, old houses, places where the walls creak and the air seems heavy with forgotten memories. 5 years ago, I rented a modest little house in the countryside, just outside the village of Wernigerode in Germany. It was a charming, half-timbered building with a slate roof and wooden beams that felt older than time itself. People said it had stood there for over 3 centuries, but they always added with a laugh, "And it hasn't fallen down yet." I wasn't laughing the night it happened. I had just moved in, still unpacking boxes, when I started noticing small oddities. At first, it was the little things you'd expect in a place that old. A creak in the floorboards where I hadn't stepped. A draft of cold air when the windows were shut tight. Nothing out of the ordinary, or so I told myself. But the bedroom was different. The moment I stepped into that room, I felt watched. Not in an obvious someone staring at you way. It was subtler, like an itch in the back of your mind. Still, I shrugged it off. What else could I do? I didn't have the money to move again, and besides, it was just a feeling. I made up the bed, threw my clothes into the closet, and tried to ignore the way the air seemed heavier in there, almost oppressive. The first night was uneventful. I tossed and turned, but eventually sleep found me. The second night, though, that's when everything changed. It started innocently enough. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to quiet my thoughts. The only sounds were the occasional groan of the old house settling and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. I wasn't scared, just restless. The kind of feeling where you know you're tired, but your mind won't stop racing. Then I felt it. The bed dipped. Just a little. Just enough to make the mattress shift ever so slightly beneath me. It felt like someone had sat down on the edge right near my legs. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My back was to the room, and I was facing the wall. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe I'd shifted in my sleep without realizing it. Maybe the old bed frame was just settling. But deep down, I knew neither of those things was true. The pressure stayed. It didn't move, didn't shift, didn't waver. Someone, or something, was sitting there. I could feel the weight, the unmistakable sensation of another presence pressing down on the bed. My mind raced through every possibility. A home intruder? No, I would have heard them. An animal? Impossible. It was too deliberate, too human. "Don't turn over," I whispered to myself. "Just don't turn over." I closed my eyes, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to scream, to jump up and run out of the house, but I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. The room was deathly silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock, which suddenly seemed unbearably loud. Tick, tick, tick. It felt like hours passed, though I know it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that it was all in my head. But then I felt it, a shift. The weight on the bed moved, as if whoever or whatever it was had leaned closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a wave of cold washed over me. That was when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper so quiet I thought I might have imagined it, but I knew I hadn't. It wasn't words, not exactly. Just a soft, raspy noise, like someone trying to speak but not quite managing it. It was right behind me, so close I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was lie there, frozen, staring at the wall and praying it would go away. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually the weight lifted. The bed creaked softly as the presence, whatever it was, moved away. I stayed there motionless for what felt like an eternity. Finally, when the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains, I worked up the courage to turn over. The room was empty. There was no sign of anyone. No indication that anything had been there at all. But the bed told a different story. On the edge of the mattress, where I had felt the weight, was a faint, human-shaped indentation, like someone had sat there for hours. My stomach turned, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I couldn't explain it, couldn't make sense of it, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone in that house. I left that same day, packing up whatever I could fit in my car and driving to a friend's place without so much as a second glance. I never went back. I didn't even bother to retrieve the rest of my belongings. The landlord called a few times, asking what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him. Now I can't sleep without a light on. I don't know what it was that visited me that night, and I hope to God I never find out. All I know is that some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some houses hold on to their secrets, and they're better left alone. Story 3. I don't believe in ghosts, not really. At least I didn't. Not until the night I spent in that godforsaken house. Even now, years later, I hesitate to talk about it. People look at you like you're crazy when you tell a story like mine. But it happened. I know it happened. And I wasn't the only one who experienced it. Back then, I was a broke college student in a small university town, sharing a rundown rental with my 2 younger siblings. The house was cheap, ridiculously cheap actually, but we didn't question it. We just needed a roof over our heads that wouldn't drain the little money we had. The house itself was unsettling. It had an odd smell, a mix of damp wood and something metallic. The floorboards creaked no matter how carefully you stepped, and the shadows seemed thicker than they should have been, even in broad daylight. But we chalked it up to age. After all, it wasn't the first old house we'd lived in. Strange things happened almost immediately, but they were small enough to ignore at first. Lights flickered randomly, doors swung open or shut on their own, and sometimes when we were sitting in the living room, we'd hear faint footsteps on the stairs even though no one was upstairs. We joked about it being haunted, laughed it off like it was nothing, until the night it happened. It was a cold, still night in November. I remember because I'd piled extra blankets on my bed to fight off the chill. My siblings and I had gone to bed early, worn out from long days at school and work. The house was unusually quiet, almost oppressively so. I fell asleep quickly, cocooned in the warmth of my blankets. I woke up to the strangest sensation. My legs felt wrong, like something was tugging at me, pulling me toward the foot of the bed. For a split second, I thought I was dreaming. You know that feeling when you're half awake, half asleep? It was like that. But then I opened my eyes and my heart stopped. I wasn't dreaming. The blankets were off me, bunched at the end of the bed. My ankles were exposed, and there was a pressure around them, a cold, unyielding grip. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. I tried to move, to sit up, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, paralyzed by some force I didn't understand. And then I started sliding. It was slow at first, like whatever had me was testing its strength. But the pull grew stronger, more forceful, and I could feel the edge of the mattress pressing against my thighs. Panic surged through me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I gripped the sides of the bed, nails digging into the wood, but it didn't help. The thing, whatever it was, kept pulling, dragging me closer and closer to the edge. Finally, I managed to grab the headboard. My hands were slick with sweat, my knuckles white from the effort. I clung to it like my life depended on it, because it did. Whatever had me wasn't letting go. My arms burned from the strain, and tears streamed down my face as I fought to hold on. And then I heard it, a scream, not mine, my sister's. It jolted me out of my terror, gave me just enough strength to finally let out a choked, guttural scream of my own. My voice sounded foreign to me, raw and desperate. At the same moment, I heard my brother yell from his room, his voice filled with the same fear that clawed at my throat. The grip on my ankles vanished. Just like that, it was gone. I fell back onto the bed, gasping for air, my whole body trembling. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was over. But then I remembered my siblings. I stumbled out of bed, my legs weak and unsteady. The hallway was dark, but I didn't bother with the lights. I practically threw myself into my sister's room. She was sitting up in bed, her face pale and tear-streaked, clutching her blankets like they were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. "It happened to you too," she whispered. It wasn't a question. Before I could answer, my brother burst in, wild-eyed and shaking. He didn't say anything, just stood there in the doorway, his chest heaving like he'd just run a marathon. We didn't need to compare notes. We all knew. The same thing had happened to all of us. The pulling, the paralysis, the cold, unrelenting grip. None of us slept that night. We huddled together in the living room, lights blazing, the TV on for background noise, though none of us paid attention to it. The hours crawled by, and when dawn finally broke, we made a pact. We were leaving. That day, we packed what we could carry and walked out of that house without looking back. Story 4. It was a gray, overcast afternoon when I drove out to the old churchyard where my grandfather was buried. He passed away when I was in college, and I hadn't visited his grave in years. The cemetery was in the middle of nowhere, tucked into a hollow surrounded by dense woods. The kind of place you don't stumble upon. You have to know it's there. The old, crumbling church at the center hadn't seen a congregation in decades, and the graveyard itself seemed frozen in time. I parked my car near the rusted gate and started the long walk toward the back, where the newer graves were. My grandfather's resting place was simple, unadorned, and peaceful, just the way he would have wanted it. I spent some time there talking to him like I used to when he was alive. It felt good to be there, but there was a strange stillness in the air. No wind, no birds, just silence, like the earth was holding its breath. On my way back, I wandered a bit. The older gravestones near the church drew my attention, the ones from the 1700s and early 1800s. Most were weathered beyond recognition, their names and dates eroded by time. But one gravestone in the very center caught my eye. It was massive, easily twice the size of any other, like a jagged monolith stabbing upward. The inscriptions were faint, but I could make out enough to know it marked someone important. Surrounding it was an old iron fence, the kind with spikes at the top. The plot itself was overgrown, the grass reaching almost waist-high. The fence was rusted but sturdy, its jagged edges tangled with vines and moss. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Curiosity got the better of me. I leaned over the fence, brushing aside the grass to get a clearer look at the markings. The name was barely legible, but I made out a date, 1790-something. That's when I heard it. Rattle. It was right next to my ear. The sound was sharp, dry, unmistakable. My heart jumped. Instinctively, I thought snake. I jerked upright so fast I nearly lost my balance. And that's when something shoved me. It wasn't a nudge. It wasn't a slip. It was a deliberate, undeniable force. I went flying backward, skidding on the damp grass and landing hard on my back. My breath caught as I scrambled to my feet, looking around for someone, something. There was nothing. No one. I stared at the gravestone, trying to process what just happened. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and the silence around me felt oppressive now, like the whole graveyard was watching. Then I noticed something. The air wasn't right. Right in front of the massive gravestone, the air was blurred, like heat waves rising off asphalt in the summer. It shimmered faintly, distorting everything behind it. But it wasn't hot. In fact, it felt colder now, bone-chillingly cold, like all the warmth had been sucked out of the air. I froze, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on that blur, trying to make sense of it. It shifted, the edges of its form becoming more distinct, vaguely human-shaped. My breath hitched as I realized it wasn't just standing there. It was moving toward me. I don't remember standing up. One second I was on the ground, the next I was stumbling backward, trying to put as much distance as I could between myself and whatever that was. My hands were shaking so badly I tripped over a gravestone, landing hard on my tailbone. The pain snapped me back to reality, and I scrambled to my feet again, bolting toward the small bridge that led back to the parking lot. When I reached the bridge, I dared to look back. I shouldn't have. It was still coming. That shimmering, distorted shape was weaving through the gravestones, closing the distance between us. It didn't move fast, but it didn't have to. There was an inevitability to its approach, like it knew I wasn't going to escape. My legs felt like lead, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I tore across the bridge, not stopping until I was inside my car, with the doors locked and the engine roaring to life. I peeled out of that parking lot, gravel spraying everywhere, and didn't look back until I was miles away. Even then, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. My mind raced trying to rationalize what I saw. Story 5. I managed a modest hotel in a quiet, unassuming part of the city. Nothing fancy, just a clean, affordable spot for travelers and business people passing through. I had been working there for a couple of years and everything had always been predictable until room 309. Room 309 wasn't cursed or infamous. It wasn't even avoided by guests at first. It was just another room. But something changed about a year after I started, something I couldn't explain. It began with the murder. A man had rented 309 for the night. I didn't know much about him. Average guy, maybe mid-40s, checked in late, paid in cash. He was quiet, polite even, but there was nothing remarkable about him. The next morning, housekeeping found him dead. Throat slit. The room looked like a slaughterhouse. Blood smeared across the walls, the sheets soaked. The police ruled it as a robbery gone wrong, but they never found the killer. We cleaned the room, replaced everything, mattress, furniture, even the carpet. We tried to forget it, and for a while it worked. Guests came and went without a hitch. Life moved on. But then the complaints started. The first one came 2 months later. A couple on a road trip checked in late. Around midnight, they came to the front desk, visibly shaken. "The lights won't stay on," the woman said. Her husband chimed in, "And there's something on the sheets." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, something on the sheets?" He hesitated. "It looked like blood." I followed them to 309, annoyed and ready to prove them wrong. The lights flicked on without issue, bright as ever. I checked the bed, crisp, clean white sheets, no stains, no blood. I chalked it up to their imagination and offered to move them anyway. But the complaints didn't stop. Every few weeks it was the same story. Guests claimed the lights wouldn't work or that there were stains on the sheets. Once, a woman swore she heard footsteps pacing back and forth all night, even though she was staying alone. Another time, a man called the desk at 3 a.m., frantic, saying someone was whispering his name from the corner of the room. Every single time I checked the room myself. Every single time it was fine, spotless, silent, normal. I told myself it was coincidence. People freak themselves out sometimes, especially when they're alone in a strange place. But one night something happened that I can't explain. It was a quiet Tuesday, just before midnight. The hotel was nearly empty, off-season, and the only occupied rooms were on the lower floors. That night, we'd moved a young woman out of 309 after she complained about strange noises and flickering lights. She seemed genuinely scared, so I put her in another room down the hall. An hour later, I was going through paperwork at the front desk when the phone rang. It was from room 311, right next to 309. A man's voice, low and shaky, came through the line. "Can you send someone up here? There's screaming, loud screaming coming from the room next door." I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The floor should have been empty. "Are you sure it's coming from next door?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Yes," he hissed. "It's like someone's being killed." I grabbed the master key and took the stairs 2 at a time. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, my heart was hammering in my chest. The hallway was silent, too silent. I knocked on the door of room 311, and the man peeked out, wide-eyed. "Still hearing it?" I whispered. He nodded, pointing toward 309. I approached 309 slowly, every step heavier than the last. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear anything at all. At first, nothing. Then faintly a scream, muffled, guttural, and filled with pure terror. I fumbled with the key, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. The room was empty. No furniture out of place, no blood, no sign of anyone, just the quiet hum of the air conditioning. My heart was pounding, my palms slick with sweat. The scream had been real. I heard it. The guy in 311 heard it. I stepped into the room, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave. "Hello!" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the emptiness. And then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, panic clawing at my throat. The lights flickered, dimmed, then went out completely. I was alone in the dark. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a whisper, faint, close, right next to my ear. "Get out!" I bolted. When I reached the front desk, the man from 311 was waiting, his face pale. "Did you see anyone?" he asked. I shook my head, still catching my breath. But I heard it. He didn't stay the night. Neither did I. Story 6. It was the dead of winter, and the nights in that house were always unsettling. It was an old, creaky place perched at the edge of the woods, a house that had seen too much and whispered secrets to anyone willing to listen. My parents loved its charm, but for me and my brother, it was a cage that trapped the shadows. I was 14, awkward and skinny, with a head full of fears I couldn't shake. My brother, 2 years older, was my shield against the unknown. We didn't talk about it outright, but we both knew there was something wrong with that house. Something waiting. Nights were the worst. The air grew thick, the silence oppressive, and every creak in the floorboards felt like a warning. That night, the cold cut deeper than usual. I woke up with that uncomfortable sensation you get when you know you're not entirely alone. My bladder didn't care about my fear, though, so I slid out of bed, careful not to make too much noise. The hallway was dim, lit only by the weak glow of moonlight leaking through the frosted windows. The bathroom was just down the hall, a few steps away, but it felt like crossing a battlefield. I had barely taken a step when I heard another set of footsteps behind me. My heart jumped, but when I turned, it was just my brother. His face looked pale, almost sickly in the cold light. "Gotta pee too," he muttered, rubbing his arms against the chill. I nodded and stepped aside. "I'll be quick." "Leave the door open," he said, his voice quieter now. "Just leave it open." It wasn't an unusual request. We had this unspoken rule about sticking together at night, no matter what. I guess it made us feel safer, even if we never admitted to being scared. I went into the bathroom, leaving the door ajar like he asked. The dim light from the hallway spilled in, just enough to keep the darkness at bay. "Still there?" I called out while doing my business, trying to sound casual. Talking helped, even if it was about nothing. It was better than the silence. He didn't answer. "Ryan?" I tried again, louder this time. Nothing. The air in the bathroom changed. It felt like stepping into a freezer, the kind of cold that made your breath catch and your skin prickle. My fingers tightened around the sink as I tried to shake off the unease. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved past the door. But it wasn't just any shadow. This thing was wrong. It didn't blur or fade like normal shadows. It was solid, like a void carved out of the air itself. And it was tall, too tall. It didn't make a sound as it passed, but its presence sucked all the warmth and noise out of the room, leaving behind a suffocating silence. I froze. My breath hitched, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. I waited, every second stretching into an eternity. When I finally gathered enough courage, I opened the door slowly, peeking out. Ryan was standing there, but something was off. His back was to me, his shoulders hunched. His body trembled like he was freezing, but I could see the sweat glistening on his neck. "Ryan?" My voice cracked. He turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see his face. His skin was as white as paper, and his eyes. I'll never forget the way they looked. Wide, terrified, and staring into nothing, as if he'd seen something his mind couldn't process. "What did you see?" I whispered, stepping closer. He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed my arm with a grip so tight it hurt. "Get out," he rasped, his voice shaking. "We need to go. Now." I didn't argue. The fear in his eyes was enough. We bolted up the stairs, our footsteps pounding against the old wooden boards. Neither of us looked back. Once we were in my room, we dove under the blankets like little kids hiding from a monster. For a long time, we didn't speak. The only sound was our ragged breathing. When the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains, we finally crawled out. Ryan sat on the edge of my bed, his hands still trembling. "What happened back there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "I don't know. I don't want to know." We never told our parents. They wouldn't have believed us anyway. But from that night on, we made a pact. Never walk the house alone at night. Whatever that thing was, we didn't want to see it again. Story 7. I used to live on the edge of town, in a small community surrounded by dense woods. My house was one of those old, creaky places where the walls seemed to hold whispers of the past. The mornings were always eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that wrapped around you like a heavy blanket. That silence was comforting at first, but after what happened, it became oppressive. It was a freezing winter morning around 5 a.m. I'd always been an early riser, and running through the wooded trails near my neighborhood was part of my routine. The air was sharp, and the frost clung to every surface, glinting faintly under the dim light of my headlamp. My breath puffed out in clouds, and the crunch of my shoes on the icy ground was the only sound. I had made it about a mile out when I decided to turn back. The woods always felt different in winter, darker, more alive somehow. The weight of the silence that morning was suffocating, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I adjusted my gloves and quickened my pace, eager to get back to the warmth of home. And then I heard it. A scream, high-pitched, ragged, and full of agony. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. It came from somewhere deep in the woods to my left. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stopped dead in my tracks, straining to hear anything else. But the silence returned, heavier now, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was probably a fox or some other animal. I'd heard stories about the sounds they make, but this was different. It was longer, more guttural, and it had a depth to it that felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Adrenaline surged through me, and I broke into a sprint. My headlamp bobbed with each stride, casting shaky beams of light ahead of me. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I kept repeating to myself, "It's nothing, just your imagination." But then, as I reached the crest of a hill, I saw it. A light. It was faint at first, a pale, phosphorescent glow in the distance, hovering above the tree line. I slowed down, my feet crunching to a stop. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared at the thing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The light wasn't stationary. It moved in slow, deliberate circles, dipping and rising in a hypnotic, almost serpentine pattern. At first I thought it might be a drone, but there was no sound, no hum of rotors, no buzz of machinery, just that oppressive, suffocating silence. The light was wrong, too. It wasn't the harsh LED glow of a drone. It was soft, almost organic, like the bioluminescence you'd see in deep-sea creatures. I stood there frozen, watching it. My logical brain scrambled for explanations, but none of them fit. My feet felt rooted to the ground, but every nerve in my body screamed at me to run. Then the light stopped circling. It hovered in place, almost as if it had noticed me, and then it dipped lower. 40 feet, 30, 20. The glow illuminated the trees around it, casting eerie, distorted shadows. I could see now that the light wasn't a single point. It shimmered, pulsated, as if alive. My mouth went dry, and I took a step back. That's when the thing moved toward me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my legs burning with every stride. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me, the woods closing in on either side. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to know if it was following me. By the time I reached my street, my lungs felt like they were on fire. I slowed to a jog, then a walk, glancing over my shoulder. The light was gone. The woods were dark again, save for the faint glow of streetlights in the distance. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. My headlamp flickered, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it was going to go out. But it didn't. When I finally got home, I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. I stood there for a long time, staring at the fabric, half expecting that ghostly light to appear on the other side. It didn't. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I moved out of that house a few months later, and I've never been back. Story 8. I worked the night shift in a warehouse that's been around since the 1940s. It's an old, creaking giant of a building, tucked away in a forgotten corner of town. The place smells like dust, oil, and time. I've always been indifferent to the ghost stories co-workers swap during breaks. Stories of shadowy figures and unexplained sounds, whispered under the harsh fluorescent lights of the break room, always struck me as ways to kill time during long shifts. But that night changed everything. It was a cold Tuesday night in January, and I had the 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. shift. The place was quieter than usual, just me and a skeleton crew scattered across different sections. Around 2 a.m., I found myself on the second floor of the oldest section of the warehouse. The air up there always felt heavier, like it was steeped in decades of forgotten stories. This part of the building hadn't been updated in decades. The wooden floors groaned under every step, and the single overhead light bulb at the far end flickered with an unnerving rhythm. The shelving units stretched high, packed with dust-coated boxes that hadn't been touched in years. My job was to retrieve a misfiled crate for inventory. I was halfway down the main walkway when I saw it. From one of the side aisles, a figure leaned out just enough for me to notice. A pale face, partially obscured by shadows, tilted slightly as if sizing me up. The movement was smooth, too smooth, and their eyes, though I couldn't make out much detail, seemed too sharp in the dim light. I stopped dead in my tracks. The air caught in my lungs. "Hey," I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. "Is that you, Mark?" Mark, my manager, was the only person who might have been up there. The figure didn't respond. Instead, they leaned back into the aisle, disappearing from view. The motion was deliberate, not hurried, almost like they were retreating just enough to avoid my sight. I don't know why I moved forward. Curiosity, maybe, or a sense of obligation to prove to myself that it was nothing. My boots echoed loudly on the wooden floor as I approached the aisle. "Mark, stop messing around," I said, more to fill the silence than anything else. When I reached the aisle, it was empty. I stared into the dimly lit space, the shelves stretching into the gloom. The boxes here were thick with dust, undisturbed for years. There was nowhere to hide, no way someone could have disappeared so quickly. And yet no one was there. The silence was deafening. My own breathing sounded too loud, too erratic. I turned back toward the walkway, my pulse quickening. That's when it hit me, the floor. In this section, the floors are ancient, all creaks and groans with every step. It's impossible to move quietly up here, yet I hadn't heard a single sound after I saw the figure. Not a creak, not a shuffle, nothing. A cold knot of fear twisted in my gut. I stood there frozen, straining to hear anything, any sign of movement. But the warehouse was silent, save for the faint hum of machinery from the newer sections downstairs. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the dim light and late hour. But as I started back down the walkway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My skin prickled, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. And then I heard it, a single, deliberate creak directly behind me. I whipped around, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. There was nothing there, just the empty walkway stretching into darkness. The air felt colder now, like a sudden draft had swept through, though there were no windows or vents on this floor. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. The creaking followed me, slow and measured, as though someone was matching my steps. I reached the stairs and practically bolted down them, my boots clanging on the metal steps. When I hit the ground floor, I didn't stop until I was back in the break room, the bright fluorescent lights a welcome relief from the oppressive darkness upstairs. Mark was sitting at the table, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. He looked up as I burst in, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "You okay?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I hesitated, unsure how to even begin explaining what I just experienced. "Were you upstairs just now?" I finally asked. He frowned. "Number why?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I grabbed my stuff and spent the rest of my shift avoiding that section of the warehouse. I never told anyone what happened that night. Not because I didn't want to, I just didn't know how to put it into words. All I know is that I haven't been back to the second floor since, and I don't plan on going there again. Story 9. I grew up in a small town in northern Switzerland where the nights can be pitch black and the hills echo with silence. It's the kind of place where people say they believe in nothing but still refuse to walk certain roads after dark. I always thought those stories were just superstitions, the kind that linger in small towns. But one night changed everything for me. It was a Friday sometime in late autumn, a few years ago. My friend Lena and I had decided to go for a drive after dinner, as we often did. The air was crisp and the roads were deserted. We chose the back roads, winding through dense woods, where the trees form a canopy overhead, blotting out what little moonlight there was. I remember the music playing softly in the background, an old playlist we hadn't updated in years. Lena was in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone, while I focused on the road ahead. The stretch we were on had no streetlights, only the occasional reflective sign or marker to guide the way. There was a kind of eerie beauty to it, the way the headlights carved out a path in the darkness. I don't know why I started thinking about my driver's ed lessons that night, but I did. Maybe it was the road itself, familiar but unsettling. My instructor, Herr Müller, had been a serious man with a penchant for storytelling. He had once pointed out a memorial cross on this very stretch of road, telling me about a teenager who had died here years ago. Drunk, reckless, and young, the boy had crashed into a tree with two of his friends in the car. I could still hear Müller's voice in my head as I drove. And this is where it happened, right at that bend. The memory sent a small shiver down my spine, but I shook it off. That was 16 years ago. Just a story. We were alone on the road, or so I thought. Then without warning, the rearview mirror lit up with blinding light, two piercing beams cutting through the darkness. I jolted forward, gripping the wheel as my stomach twisted. There hadn't been any cars behind us, not for miles. Where the hell had this one come from? "Lena," I said, my voice sharp. "Do you see that?" She looked up, startled. "See what?" "The car." I gestured to the mirror. "It's right behind us." Her confusion deepened. She glanced out the rear window, then back at me. "What car?" There's nothing there, but there was something. I could see it clearly in the mirror, a pair of headlights so close they seemed to melt into my own taillights. My heart raced. They were too close. Whoever was driving wasn't just tailgating. They were reckless, insane. Panic set in. I floored the accelerator, the engine roaring as the car surged forward. "What the hell are you doing?" Lena yelled, gripping the door. "They're going to hit us," I shouted, my eyes glued to the mirror. The lights stayed fixed, impossibly close, almost as if they were tethered to us. I braced myself, waiting for the inevitable crash. But then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights vanished. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the damp road. My breathing was ragged, my hands trembling on the wheel. I glanced at Lena, who was staring at me like I'd lost my mind. "What the hell was that?" she demanded. I shook my head, still gasping for air. I don't know. They were right there, Lena. You didn't see them." She hesitated, then shook her head. "Number I didn't see anything, but..." Her voice trailed off, and she shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I got this weird feeling. Right before you sped up, like something cold ran down my spine." I looked back at the road behind us. It was empty, just a long stretch of asphalt disappearing into the void. No car, no lights, nothing. My own taillights cast a faint red glow on the pavement, but beyond that, there was only darkness. The silence in the car was suffocating. I turned the music off. "Lena," I said slowly, "I'm not crazy. I saw those lights." "I believe you," she said, though her voice was hesitant. "But maybe it was a trick of the light, or your mind playing games." I wanted to believe her, but something about it didn't feel right. The lights had been too real, too vivid, and they hadn't just been behind me. They had been bearing down on me, almost like they were chasing me. As we sat there trying to make sense of what had happened, my eyes drifted to the roadside. And that's when I saw it, the memorial cross. It was old, weathered by years of rain and snow, but still standing, its white paint glowing faintly in the dim light from my car. Herr Miller's voice echoed in my mind again. "Right at that bend." I felt a chill creep over me, the kind that burrows under your skin and refuses to let go. Could it have been? Number. That was ridiculous. Ghosts didn't exist. And even if they did, why would they appear as headlights? "Let's get out of here," Lena said, breaking the silence. Her voice was tight, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. "I don't like this place." I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. I eased the car back onto the road, driving slower this time, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the mirror. But the lights didn't return. We didn't talk much after that. Lena stared out the window, and I focused on getting us home. When I finally dropped her off, she gave me a weak smile and said, "Maybe we should stick to the main roads from now on." I nodded, but I knew I wouldn't be driving those back roads again. Not at night, not ever. Story 10. I bought my house last year, a modest cottage nestled in the quiet outskirts of a small Swiss village. It was old with creaky wooden floors and ivy climbing the stone walls. The previous owner, an elderly man named Herr König, had lived there alone for decades before passing away in his sleep. The house had a reputation, but I shrugged off the villagers' warnings. Superstitions. Just small-town gossip, I told myself. The renovations took longer than expected. My dog Fritz, a shepherd mix, and I camped out in the smaller guest room, while the main bedroom underwent a full overhaul. I'd noticed something peculiar about Fritz. He had a strange fascination with the master bedroom. Several times I found him lying in the middle of the room, curled up like he belonged there. He never did that in any other part of the house. What made it odder was that he always settled in the exact same spot, where the carpet showed wear, as if a piece of furniture, likely the foot of the bed, had been there for years. I figured maybe he liked the old smells lingering in the carpet. One night after a long day of sanding and painting, I was dragging my sore body to the guest room when I noticed Fritz wasn't by my side. "Fritz," I called, stepping into the darkened hallway. I saw him. He was lying in the master bedroom again, his body still and ears perked. Only this time, something was different. His head was cocked slightly, his gaze fixed on the far corner of the room. The air felt colder there, heavier. "Come on, buddy," I said, clapping my hands. "Let's go to bed." He didn't budge. "Fritz," I repeated, my voice sharper now. But instead of moving, he let out a low, guttural growl, something I'd never heard from him before. My stomach turned. The kind of unease that makes your skin prickle crept over me. I stepped into the room, determined to drag him out if I had to. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, I froze. A noise stopped me dead in my tracks. A faint rhythmic tapping. It came from the corner Fritz was staring at. Tap, tap, tap. I swallowed hard. "Hello," I called out, even though I knew no one could be there. The corner was empty, nothing but shadow. Fritz growled again, deeper this time, his body tensed like he was ready to pounce. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. The tapping stopped. I stood there holding my breath, ears straining. Just as I convinced myself it had been my imagination, something shifted in the shadows. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. More like a feeling, like the room itself exhaled. Fritz barked then, a sharp, frantic noise that made me jump. "Stop it!" I snapped, though my voice trembled. I grabbed his collar, yanking him toward me, and for a moment I could have sworn the air grew warmer, like someone had moved closer. My hand grazed Fritz's fur, and it was standing on end. He fought me as I dragged him out, his eyes locked on that damned corner the entire time. When I shut the door behind us, the silence that followed was deafening. My chest heaved as I leaned against the wall, Fritz trembling at my feet. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I tried to rationalize it. Stress, fatigue, old pipes settling in the house. That's all it was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The renovations finished a week later, and I moved into the master bedroom, pushing aside the nagging unease. Fritz, however, refused to enter the room. He'd stop at the doorway, whining softly, no matter how much I coaxed him. It became a nightly ritual. Me in bed, Fritz sleeping just outside the door, always with one eye open. The night it happened, I woke up to a sound. It was subtle at first, like the faint creak of floorboards. I glanced at the clock, 3:14 a.m. The house was silent, too silent. Even Fritz, usually a snorer, was quiet. Then I heard it again, louder this time. Footsteps. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. "Fritz?" I called out softly, but he didn't respond. The footsteps grew closer, deliberate. They stopped just outside my bedroom door. I stared at the handle, holding my breath, waiting. My mind raced. Could someone have broken in? The door didn't open, but I swear I heard breathing on the other side. Heavy, labored breathing, like someone struggling to inhale. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. I grabbed the nearest thing, a lamp, and held it like a weapon. The breathing stopped. For a moment, all was still. Then the handle began to turn. My blood ran cold. It twisted slowly as if taunting me. My grip on the lamp tightened. Just as it was about to open, a sound shattered the silence. A deep, mournful groan, low and resonant, coming from inside the room. From the corner. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my throat. Nothing was there. Just the same empty space Fritz had stared at before. But the groan grew louder, resonating in my chest. It was the sound of pain, of sorrow. It was inhuman. I bolted. Lamp in hand, I threw the door open and ran down the hallway, Fritz scrambling behind me. I didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for air under the cold night sky. I never used that room again. It remains empty, the door locked. Fritz still won't go near it. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.